What's going on, everybody? Gabriel Santos here, the author of Marijuana Mindfulness, the ebook. And in today's video, I'm going to talk about how the ego or the identity doesn't want you to change, particularly in terms of, marijuana use, if you're someone who's addicted or feels like they have no control over marijuana. But this can really be transferred over to any kind of change that you want to make, but you're unable to, right? So if you're unfamiliar, I'm going to use the term ego and identity interchangeable here. And I'm actually going to use the word identity most often. And basically, the identity is something that Tony Robbins calls one of the most powerful psychological forces of human beings. And the way it works is when something you do becomes who you are, right? So for example, if you're someone who is like a son, you're a son, or you're a daughter, or you're a wife or a husband, or you're a fireman, or, those are identities that you take on and they become a part of you. And as they become a part of you, as they are a part of you, they end up dictating how you behave. And the nature of the identity is that we have a need to be consistent with our identities. So for example, if someone identifies as an overachiever and someone who succeeds, right? They need to succeed in order to feel and validate that feeling of that identity of being a winner. And so naturally what they do in their life when a goal is in front of them is they do what it takes to succeed. Whereas if someone identifies as a loser or someone who always fails, when a goal is set up in front of them, they somehow find ways to self-sabotage or to avoid and ultimately to fail. And so what happens is we gain these identities from our experiences and we take them on unknowingly sometimes, and unknowingly we play these patterns that keep these identities in play. All right. And so the tough part is when we try and make changes, our identities, our egos, they don't want to change. They want to stay the same, even if that means continuing to be a failure, continuing to be overweight, continuing to be addicted. Doesn't matter. Our identities don't want to change. They don't. Because in my experience, the identity, the ego, change to the identity and to the ego is death. And death is something we don't want, right? Physically, as human beings, we don't want to die. But egos and identities, they don't want to die. Because when we change, that means an identity is done, right? And it's this phenomenon of the identity wanting to hold on for dear life because it feels like it's going to die. And that's essentially what happens. All right. So in my journey, particularly with weed addiction, weed dependency, is that, and this was well into my journey, right? Like I had already tried to quit multiple times. I failed over 100 times. And in that journey, what I discovered one day, I was like, am I willing to no longer identify as being addicted? Because after a while, when you try and fail to quit weed, your identity of being an addict just gets reinforced over and over and over again. I'm going to quit. You smoke weed. Oh, I'm an addict. I'm going to quit. I'm going to take a break. 2 weeks pass. You smoke weed. Oh, relapse. I'm an addict, right? And so it gets to a point where it's like you're addicted to being addicted, right? Like your identity is full on meshed with being addicted. And it gets to a point where of course we don't want to be addicted, but speaking in terms of the identity, like we don't know any other way, right? If you're someone who has a messy room and every time you clean it, it just is hard and you almost like it to be messy because that's what feels natural to you. And so in my experience, how do you change an identity then? If it's so hard, if the identity is going to latch on for dear life, hold on for dear life, how do you change it? And I think the first step is to be aware that the identity doesn't want to change. And so part of the process of changing the identity is knowing that it's going to want to hold on. And so in my experience, particularly with weed addiction, to change an identity, it's in your best interest to like create a new one, So instead of calling yourself addicted, maybe you can call yourself someone who's healing, or someone who's recovering, or someone who only smokes on the weekend. So if you're going to say, for example, oh, instead of my identity being a stoner and an addict, my new identity is, I smoke sometimes on occasion. The way that you change your identity is that you back it up with the action that aligns with that identity over and over and over and over again. Especially when the old identity wants to take you back. And this brings me back to my experience last year when I didn't smoke for an entire year. 2 months into this journey, 2 months into the full year, I wanted to go back. My identity was like, what's the big deal? It's just weed. What's the big deal? What's the big deal? What's the big deal? And that was a crossroads moment, because if I had gave in to the old identity would have got revalidated and the new identity would have been lost. But my identity last year was weed-free 2019, weed-free 2019. And don't get me wrong, at the beginning, it didn't feel natural, right? It felt fake to say weed 2019. But with every day, every week, every month that I backed it up with following through, it felt more real. It felt more natural. My identity started to merge with the weed-free 2019. And when I said no to those big urges 2 months in, it compounded. It was a massive validation of the new identity. Okay? But it is in those moments of the old identity or the new identity where you have a choice. But in those moments, it's also where you need to really lift that muscle of the new identity. And it's not going to get easy until you lift that muscle enough times. Okay? So at first, right, let's say you're a full-on stoner smoking every day at 7 p.m., right? 7 p.m. is going to come. And on day one, it's going to be like, am I going to smoke? Am I not? Right? You say, I'm not. Okay, boom. Right? But you still don't feel like, you've changed. 2 weeks go by. Am I going to smoke? Am I not? No. Okay, good. Boom. 2 months go by. And then all of a sudden, right? You've been here before, baby. Right? The furthest you've ever gotten is 2 months, right? You've never gone without weed longer than 2 months. And those classic thoughts start coming in. What's the big deal? It's just weed. We have control, right? Depends on what your goals are, right? Depends on what your intention is. But that old identity is going to come creeping back, asking to be alive again. And if you really want to change, your job is to lift that muscle, engage with your new identity, and just follow through. If you want to be someone different, you got to act like that different person would act. If you want to keep being addicted, keep acting like an addict. If you want to be someone who's free, make the choices of someone who's free, right? I make it sound simple. I know in the moment it's a lot more challenging than that, but I'm giving you a brief overview of what it's like, all right? So I hope that made sense. I hope this video served you to some capacity, big or small. I appreciate you all. I love you all. And I'll see you in the next video. Peace.